The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Officer James Carter adjusted his hat, the brim casting a shadow over his weathered face. He had been patrolling the outskirts of the small town of Pinewood for years, and he knew every inch of the surrounding woods. But today, something was different. As he walked along the narrow dirt path, he heard a faint whimper. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make him stop in his tracks. He turned his head, scanning the dense underbrush for the source of the sound. There, nestled among the ferns, was a small wolf pup. Its fur was a mix of gray and white, and its eyes were wide with fear. James crouched down, extending a hand slowly. "Hey there, little guy," he said softly. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The pup whimpered again, its tiny body trembling. James noticed that one of its hind legs was caught in a trap, the metal jaws biting into its flesh. Blood stained the fur around the wound, and the pup's breathing was shallow. "Shh, it's okay," James murmured, his heart aching for the little creature. "I'm going to help you." He carefully approached the pup, speaking in soothing tones to keep it calm. With a practiced hand, he released the trap, freeing the pup's leg. The little wolf yelped in pain, but didn't try to bite or struggle. Instead, it looked up at James with trusting eyes. "There you go," James said, gently lifting the pup into his arms. "Let's get you patched up." James carried the little wolf back to his patrol car, where he kept a first aid kit. He cleaned the wound as best he could, applying antiseptic and wrapping it in a bandage. The pup whined softly but remained still, as if it understood that James was trying to help. "You're a brave little guy," James said, stroking the pup's head. "What should I call you?" The pup tilted its head as if considering the question. James chuckled. "How about Shadow? You seem like a little shadow following me around." Shadow wagged his tail weakly, and James took that as a sign of approval. He knew he couldn't leave the pup alone in the woods, especially with an injured leg. So he made a decision. "All right, Shadow," he said, opening the passenger door of his car. "You're coming home with me." James lived in a small cabin on the edge of Pinewood, surrounded by trees and nature. It was the perfect place for someone who loved the outdoors, and it quickly became a haven for Shadow as well. At first, Shadow was hesitant. He limped around the cabin, sniffing at everything and everyone with cautious curiosity. But as the days passed, he began to relax. James made sure to feed him well, giving him a mix of dog food and fresh meat. He also continued to tend to Shadow's wound, which was healing nicely. Shadow, in turn, became James's constant companion. He followed the officer everywhere, from the kitchen to the living room, and even waited patiently by the door when James had to go to work. The little wolf seemed to have imprinted on James, seeing him as his protector and provider. One evening, as James sat by the fireplace with Shadow curled up at his feet, he realized how much he had come to care for the little wolf. He had always been a solitary man, content with his own company. But Shadow had brought a new sense of purpose and joy into his life. As Shadow's leg healed, he became more active and playful. He would chase after balls in the yard, pounce on leaves that blew in the wind, and even try to help James with his chores by tugging at the broom or stealing his socks. James couldn't help but laugh at Shadow's antics. The little wolf had a mischievous streak, but he was also incredibly loyal. Whenever James came home from work, Shadow would be waiting at the door, tail wagging furiously, as if he hadn't seen his human in years. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. James taught Shadow basic commands, like sit and stay, and was amazed at how quickly the little wolf learned. Shadow, in turn, seemed to understand James's moods and would nuzzle against him when he sensed that the officer was feeling down. One day, while out on a walk in the woods, Shadow suddenly stopped and growled, his ears twitching. James immediately went on alert, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. He scanned the area but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "What is it, boy?" James asked, his voice low. Shadow's growl deepened, and he took a few steps forward, his body tense. Then, James saw it. A large, menacing bear emerging from the trees. The bear let out a roar, and James knew they were in danger. "Shadow, stay behind me!" James commanded, his heart pounding. But Shadow didn't listen. Instead, he stepped forward, his growl turning into a fierce snarl. The bear hesitated, clearly surprised by the little wolf's boldness. James took the opportunity to fire a warning shot into the air, and the bear, startled by the noise, turned and fled into the woods. James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding and knelt down to hug Shadow. "You brave little wolf," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You saved us." Shadow wagged his tail, clearly pleased with himself. From that day on, James knew that Shadow was more than just a pet. He was a true companion and protector. As the months went by, James and Shadow became inseparable. But there was still one thing that weighed heavily on James's mind: the fact that Shadow was a wild animal. He knew that one day, Shadow might feel the call of the wild and want to return to his natural habitat. One evening, as they sat by the fire, James decided to broach the subject. "Shadow," he began, "you know you're free to go whenever you want, right? I won't stop you if you feel the need to return to the wild." Shadow looked up at James, his eyes filled with something that looked almost like understanding. He nuzzled against James's hand, as if to say, "I'm right where I want to be." James smiled, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's past might come back to haunt them. He had heard rumors of a wolf pack in the area, and he worried that Shadow might be drawn to them. His fears were realized one night when he heard howling in the distance. Shadow's ears perked up, and he let out a low whine. James's heart sank as he realized that the call of the wild was indeed calling to Shadow. "Go on, boy," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "If that's where you belong, I won't stop you." Shadow hesitated, looking between James and the direction of the howls. Then, to James's surprise, he let out a soft bark and curled up at his feet, as if to say, "I'm staying right here." James felt a surge of relief and gratitude. He knew that Shadow had chosen him over the wild, and that bond was stronger than anything else. With Shadow by his side, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He continued his work as a police officer, but now he had a loyal companion who was always there to support him. One day, while on patrol, James received a call about a missing child in the woods. He and Shadow immediately sprang into action, searching the area for any sign of the lost boy. Shadow's keen senses proved invaluable. He picked up the boy's scent and led James through the dense forest, barking to signal that he had found something. They soon came across the boy, who was scared but unharmed. James radioed for backup, and soon the boy was reunited with his grateful parents. The townspeople hailed James and Shadow as heroes, and the little wolf became a local legend. From that day on, James and Shadow were known as the protectors of Pinewood. They continued to patrol the woods, keeping the town safe and forging an unbreakable bond that would last a lifetime. Years passed, and James and Shadow grew older together. The little wolf had become a beloved member of the community, and James couldn't imagine his life without him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, James reflected on their journey. Shadow had come into his life when he least expected it, and had brought him more joy and companionship than he ever thought possible. "Thank you, Shadow," James said, stroking the wolf's fur, "for everything." Shadow looked up at James, his eyes filled with love and loyalty. He let out a soft bark, as if to say, "Thank you, too." And as they sat there, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, James knew that their bond was something truly special, a friendship that would last a lifetime.